Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Julius, and good afternoon to you all. Good morning, good evening, wherever you're joining us from the world. It's always a pleasure to join such sessions and to, have a dialogue with like-minded individuals on a range of issues. So thank you very much to Kumasi Technical University and then to Craig, the center, for offering me this opportunity. What Dr. Julius didn't tell you guys is that he was actually my senior at KNUST, where we all did chemical engineering some several years. To be here today just to discuss a number of issues, particularly that which relates to the and that which pertains to uh, the development of the renewable energy industry, sort of more broadly. So it is great to be here. I will just try to speak for about 15 or so minutes, perhaps a little bit more. And please, I'm happy to have an open dialogue or questions and conversations thereafter. What I wanted to just quickly go through for this session is basically sort of a bit of a recap as to where the recent market developments have been, because I think for us to understand the Russia-Ukraine conflict, it's important to take a step back to look at what happened within energy markets more broadly in the last few years, and then look specifically at the war or the conflict and what that has done to energy transition and about renewable energy more broadly on the African continent and that of Ghana, and leaves with some concluding remarks. I hope you can all see my screen. Please let me know if you can or not, and hopefully you can also hear my voice as well. Okay, so I think just to set a bit of context and background, the point really is that in the last few years, the world has been going through very difficult times. Some have actually called it, once in a lifetime crisis, and perhaps the biggest crisis globally we faced since the dawn of the 1930s. But this was a state of the world just 2 years ago in 2020, where growth outlook in several economies was basically red because of the pandemic. We couldn't travel, we were locked down, and that had a big impact on the growth trajectory. And then fast forward with the wide availability of vaccines, the global economy began opening up again. And what used to be all these reds, as you see on your left-hand side, suddenly, is changed into green, which indicates that we're seeing more activity and improved activity levels overall. Predominantly, what this means for energy markets and what we have seen during the pandemic is that whereas demand for all the traditional sources of fuel, i.e., your nuclear, your gas, your coal, and oil went down, actually with the pandemic, and I'll come to the conflict in a moment, we actually saw a positive, uptick in the amount of renewable energies being, consumed overall. And although the levels in 2020 were still relatively lower than in 2019, what you see overall really is the fact that the pandemic has actually catalyzed to an extent, the rate of decarbonization in the global economy, with several countries announcing or tying their post-COVID recovery relief programs and efforts towards, a green recovery. So that's what you see here. And you can also see that again in terms of another metric, which is, the demand for electric cars. Again, if you look at total demand for electric cars, during the early days of the pandemic in 2020, we saw almost a 41% drop. Sorry, a 16% drop in the total, sales of cars. So this is predominantly internal combustion engines that use petrol or diesel. But at the same time, we actually saw electric cars surging by about 41%. And the key drive for this is really the fact that we're seeing the whole global net zero drive getting a lot more momentum and a lot more traction, which is what you see on your right-hand picture here. You can also see that a bit with what countries, actually said during the pandemic. So we've had over 20 countries that have announced various electrification targets or announcing an outright ban for petrol and diesel cars over or in the years, to come. And interestingly, when you actually look at the declaration by countries in terms of, some of these possible bans and these electrification targets, Ghana is one of the signatories to this document. So this is like the backdrop to what we've had just before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where several countries and several economies announced new recovery initiatives. We had COP26, which led to major declarations being made by global governments in an attempt to push their carbonization or decarbonization agenda. And then just about a year or so into that, we now had the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which in a way, one could actually argue is threatening to derail some of the drive, right, that we're seeing, including with the getting more renewable energy into the energy mix. So here, what I want to show you really is just a couple of parallels between the pandemic and what we're seeing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So the way it works out, or the channels of impact, is that you had the pandemic that led to a slowdown in the global economy, and then we saw a slowdown in overall energy demand. But for renewables, like I just showed you, we saw an uptick, in renewables growth even during the pandemic. Then we've got a similar thing with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Again, it's had a major shock on several global economies. And the question that is out now is, how will this impact energy demand, specifically electricity demand and other forms of energy demand in both the short to medium term, and then of course, more fundamentally in the long term. To break this down a bit, I think it's important to see where Russia and Ukraine sort of sit within the global commodities architecture or landscape. So what you see on your left-hand side is just a chart that I borrowed from Bloomberg that shows you, Russia is a big player within the commodity space. So for example, 78% of their gas is supplied to Europe. 22% of wheat exports from Russia go to a country like Egypt, and other commodities which directly come from Russia. And when you even look at the other commodities like crude oil and things like that, you can see by and large to what extent Russia is a big player within that, that space or that architecture. So what the war eventually then did is to send a big shock through the global economy and send a shock also in terms of how countries fundamentally, right, react to this. But this is not without, again, a bit of a recourse to history. So when Dr. Julius was introducing the session, he did indicate that, geopolitics plays a fundamental role in terms of how global energy markets operate. And I've got here, for example, just a quick chart that shows you with an example of oil prices that goes back to the 1970s and annotated over different points in time, where you can see really a lot of the geopolitical events, such as the Arab oil embargo of the late 70s, and in most recent times the OPEC production cuts, the pandemic, and now the Russia-Ukraine conflict, having a major ripple through impact on the market. But the other thing that this then does, which is the whole renewable energy debate within the context of the net zero agenda, is what does this do for economies and markets? So I want to use the next few minutes just to touch on that. I mean, the fundamental point is that in the next few decades, several of the economies in the world need to fundamentally or radically change their energy systems. And what this means is moving away from the fossil dominated system to one which is based largely on renewables. So in this case, things like solar, wind, and nuclear. And in the context of that, and in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what we have seen now is some sort of shifts within the market. And I will show you in a few slides why I think that, in the short to medium term, the rolling out of renewable energy programs and policies actually, will be stalled a bit as a result of this conflict. But it's also important really to state that when we take electricity as a whole and we break that down by different geographical jurisdictions, the narrative of the energy transition and the need to decarbonize is not or must not be construed as a one-sided story. So for example, if you look at North America, the electricity mix is predominantly natural gas, which some would argue is clean anyway, and you have about 17% of that coming from coal, which of course may have to be substituted. And then you have bits of nuclear and some hydro, and then about 12% of the mix comes from renewables. If you look at Europe, in Europe, you've got a double of that coming from renewables. So that's about 24% of their energy mix coming by way of renewables, as compared to about 22%, which is nuclear energy, and they do have some coal, right, as well. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, this is the picture. The picture is that you have largely natural gas, which is driving our energy consumption, electricity consumption. And then you have about 28% of that, which is coal. But there's a caveat here. Most of this coal consumption is actually only one country, which is South Africa. So with the exception of South Africa, and if you take that out, most of the electricity systems on the continent, some would even argue, are largely decarbonized in a way, because you've got natural gas predominantly powering the energy mix of a number of these of these countries in that respect. But what the conflict then has done, the Russia-Ukraine war has done, in my view, is really sort of pivot the whole energy transition or energy policy debate towards two strands of the trilemma. So normally we would use this trilemma to sort of examine, right, how countries make their policy choices. And the trilemma, is an even balance between security of supply on one hand, the affordability of that energy, and then the sustainability, which in other words, the environmental considerations or aspects of that energy which is being secured. And rather what we actually have seen is that regardless of the big promises that have been made by a lot of the European countries at COP26, we actually seen them now pivot some form of fossil fuels. And really this is underscored by the fact or the primary issue that security of supply is paramount. So with the sanctions that we've seen in Russia and that being imposed on them, different countries, and I've got two examples I'll just highlight in a moment, have begun actually to pivot the energy system, in my view, anchored more around the security of supply and less so on things like sustainability, in which case renewable energy begins to sort of play a role. The question or the jury which is out is whether or not this becomes a new normal going forward. What I mean by that is that despite the promises that we've seen at COP and net zero, would we see a reversion to the mean, in which was in other words, the uptake of renewable energy at a global level was still largely be very, very small. Two quick case studies to sort of illustrate this point. Germany, it's been in the news in the last few weeks. Germany imports a lot of gas from Russia. In fact, it's the largest gas importer in all of the EU. But because of the conflict, we've seen them shift their energy policy, where suddenly they are considering building two new LNG import terminals. They have also decided to prolong the use of coal-fired thermal power plants. So these plants were originally scheduled to have been shut down by 2030, but they're saying like security of supply is paramount. And in that regard, we're going to push this thing out a little bit. And this has actually drawn a lot of the eye of the critics that says that this is like going back to investing in fossil fuels, and therefore it is not sustainable in the long term. But what the government has also said, or the German government also said, is that the fact that we're trying to address the supply issues and the security of supply challenges in the short term does not mean that in the long term, we still are not going to have renewables, play a key part of that mix. So in fact, in the German case, they've actually moved forward by 15 years, the target to reach 100% of their renewable energy supply coming in at 2035 instead of 2050 in that regard. So you see that in the short, medium term, you still have these fossil fuels playing a key part because of security of supply, but in the overall long term, there's still that desire or move to have renewable energy play a part of the mix. You also have an interesting case study with Britain, where just about a week and a half ago, they published a new energy security strategy. And here what they want energy independence. And if you look at the details of that strategy, you can actually see oil and gas or fossils is still part of that strategy. And then you still have some renewables and even nuclear, and hydrogen and the likes also being, a part of that strategy. So what I'm trying to paint here, or the picture I'm trying to paint here really is that you have this sort of nuanced reaction to the pandemic, but also to the Russia-Ukraine conflict by different countries in terms of their energy strategy. But in the short to medium term, the big imperative is really around security of supply. And in that regard, you see that the fossil fuels have still now come back into the equation. And then when we look at Africa, and then I'll try to kind of wrap up in the next about 5 or so minutes. If you look at Africa, it becomes very interesting because on the one hand, it's like African countries are being, in a way, forced, or their hand is being forced to pursue a low carbon industrialization or growth pathway when several of these countries have a lot of the, significant fossil fuel resources as well as renewable, energy potential. So on one hand, you have the external pressure with COP, with the SDGs playing a role, and then you have, on the other hand, the need by countries on the continent to sort of leverage whatever energy resource they have at their disposal to grow. And this is what the vice president of Nigeria actually called out recently in a piece that he wrote in the Foreign Affairs magazine, that the attempt to curb natural gas investments on the continent actually it does, or is going to do more to hurt the continent's growth prospects. And he calls out the hypocrisy in the sense that certain countries or rich countries still have natural gas as part of their own multi-decade plans to transition to clean energy. But at the same time, they're telling African countries that, no, you cannot do that. We're not going to give you the money to do that. It also gets more interesting because when you actually look at the data, Africa collectively contributes only around 4% of global CO2 emissions. So if somebody has to do anything about it, then one could argue that surely it has to be the Western economies that need to do a lot more to cut their emissions and not impose that on African countries. And in any case, when you look even within Africa, South Africa, which is the most industrialized economy on the continent, is the one that tends to have the highest emissions. Most of the other economies are relatively negligible in the grand scheme of things. Nevertheless, what is happening is that when you look on a regional basis on the continent, you actually begin to see a very interesting picture emerge. So I'll just use the chart on your right-hand side on your screen just to explain. When we break down the fuel supply mix for the overall electricity distribution, what you actually see that in West Africa, so this is Ghana, Nigeria, and the likes, is predominantly electricity that is coming in from fossil fuels. So I mean, this would be gas-powered thermal generation. In Central Africa, your Cameroons and the Democratic Republic of Congo's is actually coming in more from hydropower, right? Have a bit more of the renewables at play. So here is predominantly geothermal energy. And in North Africa, you also have a combination of oil and gas. The bigger one is predominantly fossil. In this case, it's actually coal that is powering that. So when we then talk about the transition and renewable and all of that, and in the context of we need to be a little bit careful in terms of the policy propositions that we make, because different countries and even different regions, as you can see here, have slightly different fuel sources that they're using to power their industrialization and growth effort. And in the case of most countries, they are leveraging what is domestically available to them. So, for example, gas in the case of Ghana for power generation. But what has also then happened is that the countries recognize that we need to do our bit to support or to meet the renewable energy commitments or targets. So most of these countries have commitments, they have targets that they want to meet. In Ghana's case, we said we want to do 10% of our electricity generation coming from renewables by 2020. But here, what you can see is actually a picture that paints or shows you that policy plays a big role in terms of the ability to get renewable energy to the market. And in the last few years, we've seen solar cell prices and even wind and other things, decline. And now they are actually cost competitive to some of the traditional forms of fuels. That then means that we can actually integrate them into the mix. So let me wrap it up with Ghana and then with some sort of high level policy observation. So in Ghana's case, renewable energy, excluding hydro, if you take that out, is actually less than 1% of the total, energy mix. In 2008, we passed a law that said that by 2020, we're going to have 10% of our electricity generation coming from renewables. As we speak currently, it's less than that, and briefly in a moment. That target has actually been shifted now to 2030. And the big question again is how we're going to meet the same target, which has been shifted 10 years ahead of time. But the point is that despite our energy or electricity supply being predominantly coming from gas or thermal based, we still have a massive potential for renewable energy supply. And I think that we can actually do that 10 to 15% if we address some policy issues that is hindering the uptake of RE on the continent, but also in Ghana as a whole. The supply projections for the country indicates that by 2040, we would be at the high end, would actually need about 10,000, a little over 10 to 11,000 megawatts of electricity to be able to meet our growth efforts. In the mid case, probably about 5,000 or so megawatts of electricity. Currently, we're actually sitting around 4,500, megawatts. So the point here is that we need more supply. And is there the potential, or is there rather the potential for RE to play a role in this? I think so. And why I think so, and this is my last but one slide, is the fact that when you look at the Ghana's nationally determined contribution, so this is the document that Ghana submitted to the UNFCCC, which outlines how we are going to do our bit towards the whole global net zero decarbonization agenda. If you look at the updated document that we submitted just before COP26 of last year, there are 9 or 19 policy actions that the government says it wants to execute between 2020 and 2030. So they put a total price tag of $9.3 billion in total to be able to attain all of these initiatives. To put that into context, the whole economy of Ghana is worth about $74 billion. So 9.3 divided by 74 would give you certainly a percentage a little bit more than 10%, if not more, about 13, 14% of the country's GDP that we need to spend just to meet our commitments under the NDCs. And when you look at the areas, and I try to then rank them, you can see that the biggest spending that we anticipate is to spend $2.3 billion, or just about 25% of that 9.3 billion, on scaling up renewable energy penetration to meet that 10% target, which has now been shifted to 2030. The challenge with that and with some of the other things is that these are just ticket items. We don't have the details that anchor them. So when it comes to policy propositions, I think one of the key things that we actually need to do as a country is to be able to, in my view, leverage some of the revenues that we're already getting from like oil fields to actually accelerate investments in clean energy, and also support getting more money from some of the multilateral donors and financiers to be able to meet that new 10% target. Unfortunately, what we tend to do as a country, in my view, is often we get these tall lists, but we fall short of the details. And what investors are interested in is the details. So we need projects, we need the financing, we need to do the due diligence that goes with it. I also think in terms of gas, would have a bit of a function or a bit of a role in there, particularly for a lot of African countries. Overall, with the conflict that we're seeing, like I did indicate earlier, the medium or short to medium term impact is that many countries have started pivoting back to using fossil fuels as part of their energy mix in the medium term. And that then means that some sort of reduction in potential renewable energy. We don't know as yet whether this is going to be the long-term trend. In other words, this is going to be a reversion to the mean, which then makes nonsense of the whole commitments that countries made at COP26. But there are others who also are of an opposing view, and they argue that the Russia-Ukraine war, just like COVID-19 and just like the charts that I showed earlier, is actually going to accelerate the transition to clean energy. And that then means that in the long term, we should be able to get more investments into the sector. But for a country like Ghana, or for a continent like Africa, I always say the opportunities would always be there. It comes down to how well prepared to take advantage or leverage those opportunities. So at this point, I will pause here, and I'm sure I'll be happy to take questions once we've heard from the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very insightful presentation. I believe that we have learned a lot from your presentation. And I'm also sure that there are a number of people who have some comments or some questions, for us. So please, we can start with the remarks. If you have any remarks, if you have any comments, any question of clarification, you can ask. If you just want to also, contribute to the discussion, please feel free to do so. Said from the beginning, unfortunately, Mr. Amani couldn't join us. He is having some challenges now, and so we'll just go ahead. If he's supposed to join us, fine. If it's not, we'll just go ahead with the presentation of Dr. Sampon and just continue our discussion. All right. Okay. So I think I'm going to the chat now. All right. So there is a question here. Is there a question? this is coming from one we see. I dare say that the statistics on RE mix in Ghana, okay, is wrong. The Ministry and Energy Committee have no real means of knowing what the installed RE is in the country. But I put it forward. I put it beyond 10% if I take the data of the manufacturers of PV cells. Manufacturers of PV cells in Ghana alone. To knock at upon, it's assuming that there's enough of investment in RE, respectfully no. The government has put in place policies to deliberately limit RE uptake. They have said that as ECG is saddled with debt and there is overcapacity in the system, there is no need to allow RE investments, and has hence put a moratorium on both utility scale RE development as well as private projects. Interesting. Okay, so these are very interesting remarks or comments.
Yeah, I can give a quick remark to
Yes.
to that. Yes, the point really is that the official statistics, as we talk about here, is what the Energy Commission and the likes haven't collected in terms of electricity generation. The point which you allude to, which I could agree with, do we have any alternative statistics that are available that indicates, or some sort of market survey that indicates that if you take off-grid generation, for example, we will be including that, and that then means that the 1% could be much higher? I don't know, but that is the sort of thing that would have to be able to go out there to get that data. But these are the official statistics as published. The second point on the investment and all of that, it's an interesting point. There are two things to note here, one of which I agree with you on. So we passed the Renewable Energy Law in 2000 or the Act in 2008. We even went to the extent of having a feed-in tariff that was much higher than what was being offered to traditional thermal-based, IPPs. I recall at one point the feed-in tariff was almost about 17 cents or so per kilowatt hour. I don't know what the latest number is, by the way. But even with that tariff, it was still not able to fully incentivize the uptake of more direct or embedded renewable energy generation into the mix. Part of the issues goes down to access of financing. Parts goes back to the whole sort of investment environment. And then the second aspect of the issue, which I agree with the question that was posed, is that we signed on a lot of these IPP contracts when DUMSO, came into being in 2013 to 2016. And what that basically has done is that the onerous take-or-pay obligations and the financial impositions that they make on the Treasury, i.e. the Ministry of Finance and even ECG, means then that you're not able to bring in any new renewable energy generation into the mix, right? So I agree with that point that because of the overcapacity problem, because of how basically we didn't synchronize our energy planning the past few years, it has limited the ability of having embedded renewable energy into the system. But that's only one part of the issue. You have to go beyond to actually understand that some of the market sentiment have also, limited the ability to actually have more embedded renewable energy into the total, electricity generation mix of the country.
Thank you very much. I just also want to add that, yes, these remarks, of course, are quite interesting. And these are, for me as a researcher, working for us to go much more into the statistics that we have them. But what we need to understand is that for renewable energy, I mean the way the government, or I say the Ministry of Energy and Energy Commission also sees the uptake of renewable energy is that in 2025 days we are usually in the grid connected systems. Okay, and I think that's one of the shortfalls in our data. If you take a look at the sales volume or the importation of even the PVs that come into the country, we assume that all of, even if 80% of that is being used by us as Ghanaians, then I'm also very sure that